October 5th, 1943, Wake Island, Central Pacific. Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Sueda rolled his Mitsubishi A6M Zero into another climbing loop, executing the maneuver that had killed 9 American pilots over the past 18 months. Below him, what appeared to be another F4F Wildcat was climbing to engage, its radial engine straining at maximum power. Sueda had perfected this tactic through dozens of combat encounters. The Wildcat would follow him into the vertical climb, its heavier airframe and less powerful engine forcing it to stall out at around 12,000 feet. Then Sueda would complete his loop, diving down on the helpless American as it fell away, uncontrolled and vulnerable. The technique had become so reliable that other pilots in his unit had begun copying it. American pilots called it the hammerhead trap. Japanese squadron leaders called it textbook tactical doctrine. But this morning, something was different about the American fighter climbing toward him. Its engine note was deeper, more powerful. The airframe was larger, bulkier, yet it was maintaining speed through the climb at an altitude where every Wildcat he'd ever fought had already started to stall. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ensign Robert Duncan had been in the cockpit of his F6F Hellcat for exactly 17 minutes. This was his second aerial combat engagement, his first having occurred at Marcus Island just 3 days earlier when he dodged ground fire while strafing parked aircraft. Now, watching the Japanese Zero execute its climbing loop, Duncan did something that no Wildcat pilot could have attempted. He pushed his throttle forward, feeling the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp respond with immediate, overwhelming power. At 13,000 feet, where Wildcats stalled and died, Duncan's Hellcat was still climbing, still accelerating. At 14,000 feet, he centered the Japanese fighter in his gun sight. 650 caliber Browning machine guns spoke as one, their combined firepower tearing through the Zero's lightweight construction with devastating efficiency. Warrant Officer Sueda never completed his loop. What Duncan didn't know, wouldn't know for years, was that he had just killed a Japanese ace, a pilot with 9 confirmed victories who had been teaching newer pilots how to exploit the Wildcat's limitations. The engagement had lasted less than 40 seconds. The tactical advantage that Japanese pilots had held for 2 years had evaporated in the time it took for one American engine to outperform its predecessor. When Duncan landed back aboard the USS Yorktown, his squadron commander presented him with a bottle of Old Crow whiskey, still sealed. It would remain unopened for the rest of his life, a monument to the moment when American carrier aviation gained an advantage it would never relinquish. The Pacific Theater was about to discover that everything had changed. The aircraft Japanese pilots had learned to fear, the chunky Wildcat with its limited speed and mediocre climb rate, had been replaced by something fundamentally different. And in the coming months, experienced Japanese aces who had survived Coral Sea, Midway and Guadalcanal would confront a truth that would reshape the entire war. The American fighter they were engaging wasn't just better, it was operating from an entirely different set of physical principles that would destroy the tactical foundation of Japanese naval aviation. The F6F Hellcat had entered combat 3 weeks earlier, in August 1943, with Fighting Squadron 5's attack on Marcus Island. But its origins traced back to a small room at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York, where on April 22, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare had stood before a group of engineers with uncomfortable truths about American fighter performance in the Pacific. O'Hare had flown the F4F Wildcat in combat. He understood its strengths, its ruggedness, its capacity to absorb punishment that would destroy Japanese aircraft. But he also understood, with the brutal clarity of someone who'd watched squadron mates die, that the Wildcat's performance envelope was killing American pilots at an unacceptable rate. The Mitsubishi Zero could outclimb it below 15,000 feet. The Zero could outturn it at any altitude. And most dangerously, The Zero's combat tactics had been specifically designed to exploit these exact limitations. Grumman's engineers had already been working on a replacement design since 1938, when they'd first projected that the Wildcat would eventually become obsolete. The original prototype, designated XF6F1, had been designed around the Wright R2600 twin cyclone engine, the same power plant used in their new torpedo bomber. It was a conservative choice, representing evolutionary improvement rather than revolutionary change. Grumman was planning to build a better Wildcat, not an entirely new fighting machine. Then O'Hare walked into the room and explained exactly how American pilots were dying. The Zeros were initiating combat from superior altitude positions, using their climb advantage to dictate engagement terms. When Wildcats attempted to follow them in vertical maneuvers, the Japanese fighters would climb beyond the American aircraft's performance envelope, then drop down from above with devastating attacks. The tactical solution was obvious. American fighters needed more power, more speed, and most critically, better climb performance at combat altitudes. 4 days after O'Hare's visit, on April 26, 1942, the Bureau of Aeronautics issued a directive that would change everything. Install the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine in the second XF6F prototype. The 18-cylinder, twin-row radial engine was already powering both the Chance Vought F4U Corsair and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly 40% more than the Wright Cyclone that Grumman had originally specified. The decision was made possible by production delays affecting both the Corsair and Thunderbolt programs. The Corsair was experiencing serious problems with carrier landing visibility, while the Thunderbolt was behind schedule in meeting Army Air Force's requirements. Their setbacks freed up R2800 engines for Grumman's prototype, creating an opportunity that would prove decisive for the entire Pacific War. The modified prototype, redesignated XF6F3, first flew on July 30, 1942. Test pilots immediately reported performance characteristics that exceeded all projections. The Hellcat climbed to 20,000 feet in less than 8 minutes, nearly 2 minutes faster than the Wildcat. Maximum speed at optimal altitude measured 380 miles per hour, 62 miles per hour faster than its predecessor. But the numbers that mattered most to combat pilots were the ones that described vertical performance. The Hellcat could maintain controlled flight and positive acceleration in climbing turns that would stall a Wildcat, and it could do so while carrying more armor, more ammunition, and more fuel than any previous carrier fighter. Grumman's engineers had achieved something remarkable through systematic analysis of combat reports and ruthless attention to survivability. Where Japanese designers had sacrificed protection for maneuverability, Grumman had built protection into the fundamental airframe structure. 200 pounds of armor plating surrounded the cockpit, protecting the pilot from attacks from virtually any angle. Self-sealing fuel tanks lined with layers of rubber and fabric prevented catastrophic fires when punctured by enemy rounds. The entire aircraft had been designed to absorb battle damage and bring its pilot home, creating a fighter that could survive the kind of punishment that would turn a Zero into burning wreckage. The first production F6F3 rolled off Grumman's Bethpage assembly line on October 3, 1942, just 5 months after the prototype's first flight. By February 1943, Fighting Squadron 9 aboard the USS Essex was conducting carrier qualification trials with the new fighter. The speed of development and deployment was unprecedented for any military aircraft program, compressing what typically required 3 to 4 years into less than 18 months, from initial prototype to operational readiness. Production ramped up with extraordinary rapidity. Grumman had invested heavily in manufacturing capacity, constructing Plant No. 3 specifically for Hellcat production, while the design was still being finalized. Assembly line workers were building aircraft in newly constructed factory spaces, working around construction crews who were still finishing the building around them. By mid-1943, production had reached 500 aircraft per month, a rate that would eventually deliver more than 12,000 Hellcats before war's end. The manufacturing philosophy reflected American industrial thinking at its most pragmatic. Where Japanese aircraft required skilled craftsmen to hand-form complex curved panels, the Hellcat's body consisted of relatively simple shapes that could be stamped out quickly by semi-skilled workers. The electrical system used standardized components that minimized specialized parts. The engine installation employed the same basic mounting system that Grumman had developed for the Wildcat, allowing mechanics who'd maintained the earlier fighter to immediately service the new one with minimal additional training. Fighting Squadron 5, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Edward Owen, received its first Hellcats in July 1943. The squadron's pilots included veterans who'd flown Wildcats against Zeros, and their initial reactions to the new fighter revealed exactly how dramatic the performance improvement was. Experienced pilots who'd learned to treat vertical maneuvering with extreme caution suddenly found they could match or exceed Japanese fighters in climbs that would have been suicidal in the Wildcat. The Hellcat wasn't just faster, it had fundamentally changed the tactical options available to American pilots. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The squadron deployed aboard USS Yorktown CV 10 inches August 1943, sailing from Pearl Harbor with orders to participate in Operation Radiant, a strike against Marcus Island scheduled for August 31st. The target was a small triangular atoll, less than 1,000 miles from Tokyo, defended by Japanese fighters that would provide the first real combat test of the Hellcat's capabilities against experienced enemy pilots. Ensign Robert Duncan launched from Yorktown's deck at dawn, one of 16 Hellcat pilots assigned to provide fighter cover for the strike aircraft attacking Marcus Island's airfield and facilities. The mission briefing had been straightforward: suppress enemy fighters, protect the dive bombers and torpedo planes, and return to the ship. What the briefing hadn't mentioned, because nobody yet knew, was whether the Hellcat's promised performance advantages would actually matter in combat against pilots who'd spent 2 years perfecting their tactics against American fighters. The strike caught Marcus Island's defenders by surprise. No Japanese fighters managed to get airborne before American bombs began cratering the runway and destroying parked aircraft. But ground-based anti-aircraft fire proved immediately dangerous, demonstrating that while the Hellcat could survive aerial combat, ground fire remained deadly regardless of aircraft type. Duncan's first experience of being shot at came when a 25mm shell punched a hole through his port wing, the impact shocking him with the brutal reality that people were trying to kill him. That initial mission ended without aerial combat, but it established important operational lessons. The Hellcat's ruggedness wasn't theoretical. Duncan's aircraft had taken battle damage and kept flying, bringing him back to Yorktown without emergency procedures or dramatic carrier landing complications. The armor worked. The self-sealing fuel tanks worked. The entire aircraft performed exactly as designed, and every pilot who'd taken ground fire and returned safely became an immediate believer in Grumman's design philosophy. 5 days later, on October 5, 1943, Fighting Squadron 5 launched from Yorktown as part of a dawn strike against Wake Island. The target held bitter memories for American forces. Wake had fallen to the Japanese in December 1941 after a desperate defense by US Marines who'd fought against overwhelming odds with inadequate air cover. Now, nearly 2 years later, American carriers were returning with aircraft that would have changed the outcome of that earlier battle. 24 Hellcats escorted the strike aircraft, climbing to 15,000 feet as they approached Wake's lagoon in the pre-dawn darkness. The sun was just beginning to illuminate the eastern horizon when radar operators aboard Yorktown detected Japanese fighters climbing to intercept. Lieutenant Commander Owen calmly issued tactical orders over the radio, positioning his fighters to meet the threat while maintaining coverage for the vulnerable strike aircraft below. Duncan spotted the Japanese Zeros at 14,000 feet, climbing rapidly in a tactical formation that suggested experienced pilots who understood how to exploit superior climb performance. But as the two formations converged, Duncan realized something that would have been immediately obvious to the Japanese pilots if they'd had more current intelligence. The American fighters climbing toward them weren't Wildcats. The silhouettes were similar enough to cause confusion at distance, both aircraft featuring radial engines and similar overall proportions. But the performance characteristics were entirely different. The first Zero to engage Duncan chose the climbing loop tactic that had killed so many Wildcat pilots. It was textbook Japanese doctrine, proven through hundreds of successful encounters, based on fundamental principles of aerial combat that every Japanese fighter pilot learned during training. Higher performance aircraft could always dictate engagement terms by controlling altitude. The Zero could outclimb the Wildcat below 15,000 feet. Therefore, vertical maneuvers would force American fighters into unfavorable positions where they could be destroyed at leisure. Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Sueda had executed this exact maneuver so many times that it had become instinctive. Begin the climbing loop from slight altitude advantage. Wait for the American fighter to follow. Watch for the stall and loss of control that always came at 12 to 13,000 feet. Complete the loop, drop down from above, and open fire before the American pilot could recover. 9 times this tactic had resulted in confirmed kills. 9 American pilots had died because they'd flown Wildcats into vertical maneuvers, where the Zero's performance advantages were absolute. But Duncan was flying a Hellcat with 2,000 horsepower pushing against 3,500 feet of altitude where Wildcats lost their battles. He followed Sueda into the climb, with throttle pushed to the stop, watching his airspeed indicator carefully while maintaining perfect position behind the Japanese fighter. At 12,000 feet, where Wildcats stalled, the Hellcat was still accelerating. At 13,000 feet, Duncan began closing the distance. At 14,000 feet, with Sueda beginning the top of his loop, Duncan pressed his trigger. The .650 caliber Browning machine guns that constituted the Hellcat's primary armament represented another fundamental advantage over both the Wildcat and Japanese fighters. The Wildcat had carried .450 calibers with limited ammunition capacity. Japanese fighters typically mounted 2 rifle-caliber machine guns and sometimes 1 or 2 20mm cannon, but with significantly less total throw weight than American installations. The Hellcat's 6 guns, each loaded with 400 rounds of ammunition, could deliver sustained fire that literally sawed enemy aircraft in half. Sueda's Zero came apart under that concentrated firepower. The lightweight construction that gave Japanese fighters their legendary maneuverability became a fatal liability when subjected to the kind of damage that American armor and self-sealing tanks were designed to survive. The Zero had no armor protection. Its fuel tanks would burn when punctured. And at 14,000 feet, when Duncan's guns hit, there was no altitude remaining for recovery maneuvers or emergency procedures. Duncan pulled out of his climbing attack and immediately looked for additional targets. Squadron tactical doctrine emphasized maintaining energy and altitude advantage, using the Hellcat's superior speed to engage and disengage at will, rather than accepting prolonged turning fights where Japanese aircraft retained some advantages. But the engagement was already ending. Other Hellcat pilots had destroyed multiple Zeros using similar tactics, and the surviving Japanese fighters were breaking off, diving away toward Wake Island's airfield in hopes of reaching friendly anti-aircraft protection. When Duncan trapped back aboard Yorktown later that morning, his combat report described 2 confirmed kills, though he had no idea that his second victim had been an experienced ace. The squadron intelligence officer carefully recorded the details. Initial engagement at 15,000 feet. Climbing attack from stern position. Enemy aircraft destroyed after brief burst of fire. The clinical language couldn't capture what had actually happened. Japanese tactical doctrine, developed through 2 years of combat experience and proven effective against American fighters, had just failed completely against an opponent it hadn't been designed to counter. The bottle of Old Crow whiskey that Lieutenant Commander Owen presented to Duncan wasn't just congratulations for a successful mission. It was recognition that Fighting Squadron 5 had just demonstrated the Hellcat could do something that no previous American carrier fighter had managed. It could beat Japanese aces at their own tactics, in the vertical maneuvering regime where Zero pilots had held absolute dominance since the war's opening. Months. Over the following weeks, as more Hellcat squadrons deployed to carrier task forces operating across the Pacific, Japanese pilots began encountering a consistent pattern that contradicted everything their training and experience had taught them. American fighters that looked like Wildcats were performing like entirely different aircraft. Climbing attacks that should have been safe were resulting in Japanese losses. Vertical maneuvers that should have guaranteed kills were instead becoming death traps. But understanding that a new American fighter had entered service, and understanding what that fighter could actually do, were two very different problems. Japanese intelligence had captured some information about the Hellcat's existence from radio intercepts and from pilots who'd survived encounters with the new fighter. What they didn't have was systematic technical intelligence about its performance capabilities, its tactical limitations, or the strategic implications of its deployment in massive numbers across the entire Pacific theater. In Tokyo, staff officers at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters reviewed the scattered reports with growing concern. The Americans appeared to have fielded a new carrier fighter with significantly improved performance over the Wildcat. But without captured examples or comprehensive technical analysis, Japanese planners had no reliable way to assess just how dramatic the advantage might be. The solution their tactical doctrine had relied upon since Pearl Harbor, superior Japanese pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability, defeating technically inferior American opponents, was about to collide with an industrial and engineering revolution that would destroy the foundations of their entire air war strategy. The morning of December 4, 1943, over Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, established the pattern that would define aerial combat for the remainder of the Pacific War. 91 Hellcats from Task Force 58 engaged 50 Mitsubishi Zeros defending the Japanese base. The engagement lasted less than 30 minutes. When it ended, 28 Japanese fighters had been destroyed. 2 Hellcats had been lost. The kill ratio of 14-1 wasn't just a tactical victory, it was mathematical proof that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of Pacific air power. Japanese pilots who survived these encounters began reporting consistent observations that contradicted their training and experience. The new American fighters looked similar to Wildcats, shared the same basic radial engine configuration, but performed like entirely different aircraft. Most troubling were reports of American fighters maintaining controlled flight in vertical maneuvers that should have forced them to stall. Japanese tactical doctrine, carefully developed through years of combat experience, was failing against opponents who refused to accept the limitations that had defined previous engagements. At Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo, intelligence officers struggled to assemble a coherent picture of American fighter capabilities from fragmentary combat reports and radio intercepts. Some pilots reported engaging what appeared to be improved Wildcats. Others described encounters with fighters that seemed to possess significantly enhanced performance. The confusion was understandable. The Hellcat and Wildcat shared similar silhouettes when viewed at combat distances, and Japanese pilots had no systematic way to distinguish between aircraft types during brief, violent engagements. What Japanese intelligence didn't understand was the scale of American production. By early 1944, Grumman was completing 500 Hellcats per month, a production rate that exceeded Japan's total fighter output across all manufacturers and all aircraft types. Every month, more Hellcats were entering service than Japan could replace through its entire aviation industry. The arithmetic of attrition was becoming inescapable. Even if Japanese pilots maintained kill ratios that matched American performance, which they increasingly could not, the sheer number of Hellcats arriving in the Pacific would eventually overwhelm Japanese air defenses through numerical superiority alone. The strategic implications extended far beyond tactical air combat. American carrier task forces, protected by Hellcat combat air patrols, could operate with impunity throughout the Pacific. Japanese land-based aircraft, attempting to attack American invasion fleets, were being systematically destroyed before they could reach their targets. The protective coverage that Hellcat squadrons provided became so reliable that American pilots began calling it the Big Blue Blanket, a reference to the constant presence of Navy fighters over every major operation. By June 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where Japanese naval commanders felt compelled to risk their remaining carrier forces in a decisive engagement. The American invasion of Saipan in the Mariana Islands represented an existential threat to Japanese defense planning. If the Marianas fell, American B-29 bombers would be within range of the Japanese home islands. The Pacific Fleet's main carrier force would have to be destroyed, or Japan's ability to defend its conquests would collapse entirely. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa assembled the mobile fleet with 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, and supporting cruisers and destroyers. The carrier air groups embarked approximately 450 aircraft, including Zeros, Judy dive bombers, and Jill torpedo bombers. But the force that had once represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation had been fundamentally weakened by 2 years of attrition warfare. Many of the pilots were recent graduates of training programs that had been dramatically shortened to replace combat losses. The veteran, aviators who'd attacked Pearl Harbor, fought at Coral Sea and Midway, were largely gone, killed in combat, or assigned to training duties in Japan. Facing Ozawa's mobile fleet was Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, the largest concentration of carrier aviation power ever assembled. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, and supporting vessels deployed in 4 task groups that stretched across the Philippine Sea. The carrier decks held approximately 900 aircraft, with Hellcats comprising the majority of the fighter complement. The numerical advantage was overwhelming, but numbers alone didn't capture the full disparity. American pilots averaged more training hours than their Japanese counterparts. American aircraft were supported by logistics systems that ensured continuous availability, and American tactical doctrine had been specifically refined to exploit Hellcat strengths while minimizing Japanese advantages. June 19, 1944, began, with American radar operators detecting large formations of Japanese aircraft approximately 130 miles west of the task force. Fighter directors, officers who coordinated defensive fighter deployments from shipboard combat information centers, calmly vectored Hellcat combat air patrols to intercept positions. The system represented another American advantage that Japanese forces lacked. Fighter directors used radar information and radio communications to position defending fighters at optimal altitude and bearing before enemy aircraft came within visual range, creating engagement conditions that maximized American tactical advantages. 450 Hellcats and a few F4U Corsairs launched to meet the Japanese attack. The melee that followed would be remembered by one American pilot who remarked afterward, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." The comment gave the engagement its enduring nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, though the official designation remained the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The first wave of Japanese aircraft, 69 fighters and bombers, encountered 220 Hellcats positioned 55 miles from the American carriers. The engagement was devastatingly one-sided. Japanese formations, already disrupted by the long overwater flight and affected by inadequate navigation, faced American fighters that held every advantage. Superior altitude, superior speed, superior firepower, and most critically, advance warning that allowed defenders to position themselves optimally before the attack arrived. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrasiu of Fighting Squadron 16 was vectored toward a formation of Japanese dive bombers attempting to attack the carriers. In 8 minutes of sustained combat, Vrasiu destroyed 6 enemy aircraft, an achievement that demonstrated both the Hellcat's capabilities and the vulnerability of inadequately trained Japanese pilots flying obsolescent aircraft. against superior opposition. Each kill followed the same pattern. Vrasyu would position his Hellcat for an attack run, close to effective firing range, trigger his 650 caliber machine guns, and watch the target aircraft disintegrate under concentrated fire. The second Japanese attack wave met similar results. The third wave lost over half its aircraft without inflicting significant damage on American ships. A fourth attack, consisting of 49 aircraft, was intercepted by 27 Hellcats over Oroti Field on Guam as the Japanese aircraft attempted to land and refuel. 30 of the 49 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The remainder were damaged beyond repair. By the end of June 19th, Japanese carrier aviation had been effectively annihilated. Over 346 carrier aircraft had been destroyed in aerial combat, with minimal damage inflicted on American forces. The Hellcats had lost 23 aircraft in air-to-air combat against destruction of hundreds of Japanese fighters and bombers. The kill ratio approached 15-1, numbers that seemed impossible except that multiple witnesses from both sides confirmed them through independent observations. For Japanese pilots who survived these encounters, the experience was psychologically devastating. Chief Petty Officer Tetsuzo Iwamoto, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces with over 90 credited victories, flew Zeros from Rabaul through 1944. His combat reports documented increasing encounters with American fighters that could match or exceed Zero performance in every flight regime except turning radius at low speeds. Iwamoto claimed 39 Hellcat victories during his career, but his accounts reveal the fundamental shift in tactical dynamics. Where earlier engagements against Wildcats had allowed Japanese pilots to exploit climb and maneuver advantages, encounters with Hellcats required extreme caution and careful selection of engagement conditions. The few Japanese pilots with sufficient experience and skill to survive combat against Hellcats developed specific tactical responses. They avoided vertical engagements entirely, recognizing that American fighters held insurmountable advantages in climb performance. They refused prolonged combat, understanding that Hellcat firepower would destroy Zero's lightweight construction if American pilots achieved sustained firing positions. Most critically, experienced Japanese pilots taught newer aviators to break off and disengage the moment combat conditions became unfavorable, prioritizing survival over achieving kills. But these defensive tactics, while necessary for individual survival, could not achieve the offensive objectives that Japanese naval aviation required. Task forces needed to sink American carriers. Air defense required destroying incoming strike aircraft before they reached their targets. The tactical conservatism that kept experienced pilots alive meant those pilots could no longer accomplish strategic missions that required accepting risk and pressing attacks home despite casualties. The technical comparison between the Hellcat and Zero revealed design philosophies that reflected fundamentally different approaches to naval aviation. The Zero achieved its legendary maneuverability through systematic weight reduction. The airframe weighed approximately 5,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly 3,000 pounds lighter than the Hellcat. This weight advantage allowed the Zero to turn inside any Allied fighter at low speeds, execute impressive aerobatic maneuvers, and climb rapidly from sea level to medium altitude. But achieving this performance required engineering compromises that became fatal vulnerabilities in combat against heavily armed American fighters. The Zero carried no armor protection for the pilot. Fuel tanks were not self-sealing, meaning any puncture would result in catastrophic fire. The lightweight, airframe construction could not withstand significant battle damage. Experienced American pilots discovered they could destroy Zeros with brief firing passes that would merely damage more robust Allied aircraft. The Hellcat's design philosophy prioritized pilot survival and operational effectiveness over aerobatic performance. 212 pounds of armor plating protected the pilot from attacks from virtually any direction. Bullet-resistant glass in the windscreen could stop rifle-caliber rounds and even deflect some cannon shells. Self-sealing fuel tanks, constructed with layers of rubber that expanded when penetrated to close puncture holes, prevented the catastrophic fires that destroyed so many Japanese aircraft. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine itself provided additional protection, its substantial mass-absorbing battle damage that would have destroyed lighter power plants. This protection came at a cost. The Hellcat's loaded weight exceeded 9,000 pounds, nearly double the Zero's weight. Maximum speed at optimal altitude measured 380 miles per hour, significantly faster than the Zero's 338 miles per hour, but achieved through brute power rather than aerodynamic refinement. The Hellcat could not match the Zero's turning performance at low speeds, requiring American pilots to avoid prolonged turning engagements and instead exploit advantages in speed, firepower, and diving performance. The 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the Hellcat's wings represented firepower that exceeded anything Japanese fighters could mount. Each gun carried 400 rounds of ammunition, providing approximately 30 seconds of sustained firing. The combined weight of fire from all 6 guns could soar through aircraft structures, destroy engines with concentrated hits, and achieve kills with firing passes that lasted only 2 or 3 seconds. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with othermost Hellcats consistently reported the devastating effectiveness of American firepower, describing how brief bursts could destroy aircraft that had survived previous combat damage. American tactical doctrine evolved to maximize these advantages while minimizing the Zero's remaining strengths. The Thutch weave, developed by Commander John Thutch early in the war, became standard practice for Hellcat formations. When Japanese fighters attempted to engage, American sections of 2 aircraft would cross paths, creating mutually supporting positions where any enemy pilot pursuing one Hellcat would expose himself to fire from the other. The tactic transformed what could have been individual dogfights into coordinated defensive maneuvers that leveraged American advantages in firepower and protection, while negating Japanese advantages in turning performance. Fighter directors coordinating from shipboard combat information centers positioned Hellcat combat air patrols at optimal altitudes, typically 15 to 20,000 feet, where American fighters could dive on approaching Japanese formations while maintaining energy advantages. The radar-directed intercept system meant Hellcats rarely needed to climb from low altitude to meet incoming raids, avoiding the flight regime where Zeros retained some performance advantages. By late 1944, the cumulative effect of these tactical and technical advantages had transformed the air war over the Pacific. Japanese units that had previously achieved kill ratios of 3 or 4 to 1 against Wildcats were struggling to achieve parity against Hellcat formations. The 64th Sentai, an experienced Imperial Japanese Army Air Force unit flying Ki-43 Oscars, reported losing 17 aircraft while claiming 25 Allied fighters during October and November operations over the Philippines. For a unit that depended on numerical efficiency to offset industrial disadvantages, these results represented tactical defeat. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots extended beyond simple fear of combat. Veterans who had dominated Pacific skies during 1942 found themselves unable to achieve kills against Hellcats, even when tactical conditions favored Japanese forces. Replacement pilots, lacking the extensive training that earlier generations had received, proved catastrophically vulnerable to American pilots who understood how to exploit Hellcat advantages through systematic application of superior tactics. Japanese training accidents began mirroring combat losses as inexperienced pilots attempted maneuvers that pushed their aircraft beyond structural limits. The lightweight construction that made Japanese fighters so maneuverable also created vulnerabilities to high-G loading during extreme maneuvers. Pilots attempting the tight turns and violent aerobatics that had characterized early war tactics were experiencing structural failures that killed them before they ever reached combat. Lieutenant Junior Grade Charles Mallory, flying from USS Essex during operations over the Philippines in October 1944, encountered a formation of Japanese fighters at 18,000 feet. The engagement demonstrated how completely tactical dynamics had shifted. Japanese pilots, recognizing Hellcats rather than Wildcats, immediately broke formation and attempted to disengage. Mallory and his wingman pursued, using superior speed to close range despite Japanese evasive maneuvers. The engagement ended with 2 Japanese fighters destroyed, and the remainder fleeing toward land bases rather than attempting to continue combat. This pattern, Japanese forces attempting to avoid rather than seek combat with American fighters, became increasingly common during the war's final year. Fighter sweeps that once resulted in intense aerial battles now frequently ended with minimal contact as Japanese units withdrew rather than accepting engagement on unfavorable terms. The few Japanese pilots with sufficient skill and experience to survive understood that aggressive tactics against Hellcat formations were suicidal, while newer pilots lacked the capability to successfully engage under any conditions. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace with 34 victories all achieved in Hellcats, demonstrated the aircraft's capabilities during the Battle of Leyte Gulf on October 24, 1944. McCampbell and his wingman Ensign Roy Rushing encountered a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft, bombers escorted by Zeros. Despite being outnumbered 30-1, McCampbell and Rushing attacked repeatedly, using superior speed to engage and disengage at will. The engagement lasted over an hour, with McCampbell destroying 9 Japanese aircraft and Rushing adding 6 more kills. Neither American pilot was seriously hit, despite being heavily outnumbered throughout the engagement. The 15 total kills McCampbell and Rushing achieved that day remained the record for a single 2-plane section throughout the war. But beyond the individual achievement, the engagement demonstrated the fundamental imbalance that now characterized Pacific air combat. 2 Hellcat pilots with adequate training and sound tactical awareness could destroy formations of Japanese aircraft that outnumbered them decisively, then return safely to their carrier, despite ammunition depletion and fuel exhaustion. By war's end in August 1945, Hellcats had been credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. The aircraft accounted for 75% of all aerial victories recorded by the U.S. Navy in the Pacific Theater. 306 pilots became aces while flying Hellcats, more than any other American fighter type. The 19-1 kill ratio that Hellcat squadrons achieved over their entire combat career represented not just technical superiority, but systematic application of industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and strategic planning that Japanese forces could not match or counter. The final operations involving Hellcats demonstrated how completely American naval aviation had achieved dominance over Japanese air power. During the final raids on the Japanese home islands in July and August 1945, American carrier task forces operated within sight of Japanese territory with virtual impunity. Japanese air defenses, once considered formidable enough to make carrier operations suicidal, could not mount effective resistance against the massed formations of Hellcats and other American aircraft that struck targets throughout Japan's industrial heartland. When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, several ships that had fought at the Battle of the Philippine Sea were present in Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremonies. The Hellcats that had destroyed Japanese naval aviation had made possible every subsequent American operation, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa to the final assault on Japan itself. The aircraft that Japanese aces had dismissed as another American fighter, similar to the Wildcat they'd learned to defeat, had instead proven to be the instrument that destroyed Japanese air power and enabled American victory across the Pacific. Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Sueda never knew what killed him that morning over Wake Island in October 1943. He executed the climbing loop that had destroyed 9 American fighters, confident that another Wildcat was following him into the vertical maneuver that always ended the same way. But Ensign Robert Duncan wasn't flying a Wildcat, and the 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp pushed him through the altitude where Wildcats stalled and died. The engagement lasted 40 seconds. One experienced Japanese ace was dead, and the tactical foundation of Japanese naval aviation had just crumbled. Duncan kept that bottle of Old Crow whiskey unopened for the rest of his life, a monument to the moment everything changed. Japanese pilots called the new American fighter easy target before they encountered it. After their first engagements with Hellcats, the survivors never used that phrase again. They called it what it was, the aircraft that had destroyed their advantage and transformed the Pacific War into a contest Japanese air power could no longer win. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.